stream should be live now. And in fact, I see it on my phone, so okay, maybe not. It should spin up on my phone momentarily. But anyway, welcome to this stream. Looking forward to seeing it on my phone for the simple reason that my phone is how I am going to see this on Twitch and see the chat. So there we go. It is up and running. So today we're doing OpenHistoricalMap again. We're going to be looking at a completely different topic in OpenHistoricalMap. What we're interested in, and let me take a moment to check something in OBS just to make sure. Yeah, so it looks like all the sensors are doing what I think they should be doing. Anyway, back to what we're talking about. One of the maps and projects I've got going has to do with the Maryland campaign of 1862 and the Battle of Antietam, which was September 17th, 1862, in the area around Sharpsburg, Maryland. It's originally became an interest of mine as I came to understand that I had a family connection to the battlefield, and that my great-great-grandfather Christian Welty and my great-great-grandmother Susan Poffenberger Welty had lived in close proximity to the battlefield at the time of the battle. And so I started to really work on understanding the battle. I visited it a number of times and done a fair bit of research and familiarization with the literature. And so knowing a lot about what resources are available led me to start thinking about mapping it in OpenHistoricalMap. So this on the screen right now is the current map of Antietam in OpenHistoricalMap. And you can see that we have surprisingly good, well, I don't want to say surprisingly good. I mean, I mapped this myself, and I'm going to explain to you how I came to map this. But we know what areas were cropland. We know what areas were woods. We know where the roads were in 1862, which is different from where the roads are today in a number of regards, because of course highway departments move roads around. It's one of the things they do. And because there are some limitations to my knowledge, you see that what was cropland in 62, 61, and they're in 63. I basically tried to be very careful about what I think I know. There's still a lot of work to do on this, but we should talk about how I got where I am and what I'm going to be trying to do going forward. So, Antietam, where is it? This is a modern map in OpenStreetMap. Frederick, Maryland, Hagerstown, Maryland, Martinsburg, West Virginia, and the Antietam Battlefield is right here, sitting on the east side of the Potomac River. And Antietam Creek is what the battlefield's named after, and this is the Antietam Creek. Sometimes the battle is referred to as the Battle of Sharpsburg. Sharpsburg, Maryland is the small town located here. If we go back to OpenHistoricalMap, there is Sharpsburg right there, and the footprint today is not a whole lot bigger than it was back in 1862, and there's a lot of historic preservation there. So how did I get this far? Well, this map in MapWarper
is one of the COPE maps, COPE. It's named after a lieutenant colonel, I believe, from the Department of the Army, who was charged with making a series of maps of the battlefield in the first decade of the 1900s. He did so under the supervision of Ezra Carver, and I'll explain a little bit about Carver in a moment. But he basically went out, surveyed the battlefield as it appeared 40 years after the battle, and put together a map that shows a lot of things, including such things as the type of forestation. You know, here are woods, more woods. Here is a cornfield, and honestly, I need to tell you that while there are many cornfields on the battlefield, this one that the mouse is over right now is the cornfield, for reasons which you would learn from the history of the battle. It's highly likely that my great-great-grandfather and great-great-grandmother were living somewhere up in this area at the time of the battle, although that's not 100% proven. Basically, the night before the battle, 3 Corps under General Fighting Joe Hooker camped here. The time of the battle, they started marching south. They marched across this field, they marched into this cornfield, and the Confederates on the south side of the cornfield started firing through the cornfield, because while it tends to hide people, the bayonets sticking out above the corn show that there are troops in the cornfield, and the corn's hardly an obstacle to a musket ball. So the cornfield is kind of famous, and there's a reason why it is the cornfield. So the other thing you'll see if you look at this COPE map is that it has troop positions marked. And in fact, what COPE did, once again under the direction of Ezra Carver, was he did a series of maps. He used the same base map for all of them, but they show at intervals of a half an hour to an hour over the course of the battle on the 17th the troop movements. There's a 1904 edition of this map. There's a 1908 edition of these maps, and the 1908 revision is the one that I have been using. It is, as far as I can tell, the one to use because it contains a number of corrections. And this map rectifies pretty well. Georeferencing is of good quality, and as we have landforms, we have fence lines, we have farm lanes, we have the local roads, all in good detail. So this map is very heavily based on the COPE map, this map in its current form. Now, the day of the battle, what had happened is that Lee had crossed the mountains to the east, you know, where the mouse is now, and he had found out from scouts that the Union soldiers were coming, so he set up a perimeter around Sharpsburg. He had the advantage of what are called interior lines, which is to say that it was a relatively compact U-shaped position, and he could, if under pressure, he could move troops from one part of his lines to another fairly easily. At the beginning of the battle, he did not have his full force on hand because he had sent Stonewall Jackson's corps to Harper's Ferry to the south in order to take the Federal arsenal. And so he did not have all of his forces on hand at the start of the battle. Union forces forced their way over the passes on South Mountain to the east. They also forced their way over passes down here and would eventually attempt to drive Jackson out, but Jackson had gotten what he wanted out and headed north, and he would arrive at the battlefield late in the day. McClellan was hardly Lincoln's first choice for the commander at this point,
John Pope had just been soundly defeated at Manassas in the battle that is normally called Second Manassas, and Pope had been summarily relieved. He had been sent west to fight Indians and would not reappear in the narrative of the Civil War. McClellan, well, Lincoln wasn't really very happy with McClellan, but he was all that Lincoln had, so McClellan's in charge. So it's important to mention Ezra Carman, an overlooked figure at times. Carman had been a Union officer during the war, and he had fought both at Antietam and at Gettysburg. And post-war, Carman had become involved in historical preservation efforts, at first at Gettysburg, but subsequently he moved down and became the most prominent figure associated with preserving the Antietam Battlefield. And around 1900, plus or minus, he had 3 tasks assigned to him. One task was to produce historical markers on the battlefield, and the extremely large cast iron historical markers Carman supervised are still present in the National Battlefield Park to this day. As you go around, you'll find multiple different markers. The painted metal markers, the ones that look pretty old, are in fact 120 years old. They're the ones that Carman was responsible for. Carman also was charged with producing the maps, and those were the maps produced by Cope under Carman's supervision. And the third thing Carman was charged with was writing a pamphlet describing the battle. He never completed the pamphlet, because what ended up happening was he ended up producing a manuscript for a book, which was not published at the time. And about 20 years ago, there was considerable interest in seeing if Carman's manuscript could be made into a publishable form. The manuscript was not a mystery to historians. While it was never published, in general, your better grade of Antietam historians were fully aware that the Carman manuscript had existed. They often made research trips to examine the manuscript. It was tended to be heavily referenced in Antietam books, but it itself was unavailable unless you went to the trouble to get to it. So back around 2010, 2 editions of the Carman manuscript were finally published for real. One of them by Pirro is a very serviceable publication of the manuscript. There's nothing wrong with Pirro, but the really important one is this one that I have up in the Amazon page, which is edited by Thomas Clemens. And Tom Clemens is an extremely good historian, smart guy, nice guy. He even answers my emails on occasion. And as his PhD thesis under Joe Harsh, he edited the first third or so of the Carman manuscript and basically reverse engineered the footnotes, because it's very common in manuscripts around the turn of the century, 120 years ago, to casually plagiarize and to not give sources and not give footnotes, and just write it out. And Carman's manuscript was all of that. And so Clemens' task for his PhD was basically going through and trying to figure out what Carman's sources had to be. And that is what distinguishes Clemens' edition from the Pirro edition, is the really meticulous documentation of sources. Because Carman's papers survive, and they don't appear to all be in one place. There's a big chunk of them in the New York Public Library collection, and Clemens certainly spent some time in the archives of the NYPL going through boxes of manuscripts that might not have been looked at for 100 years. And I have a copy of this, and it is outstanding work. It's in 3 volumes. It's also hardly a perfect work. It's extremely common in history of the late 1800s, early 1900s to have a lot of opinion mixed in. Of course, you get histories today with lots of opinion mixed in, but that's another story. But Carman, for example, was extremely negative about George McClellan, and that negativity certainly impacted accounts of McClellan to this day. A lot of that criticism doesn't hold up. Some of it certainly does hold up, but McClellan is a very complex figure and not just a straight-up villain like so many people want him to be. Clemens will talk about discovering things. I mean, Dad and I took a tour of the approaches to Antietam shortly after the publication of this first volume years ago, led by Clemens and by Dennis Fry, who at the time was chief historian of the Harper's Ferry National Park. And Clemens talked quite a bit about the challenges of the research. He discovered things that had been mysteries in the Carman manuscript. Because one of the things that survived in the Carman papers was his correspondence, because much of what is in the Carman manuscript was the result of correspondence with veterans of both sides of the battle. And there are many things that are only known because they are in letters in the Carman archives and made their way into the Carman manuscript after the fact. So this is a key part of the literature. You know, the Cope maps and the Carman manuscript are really, really important. And as I say, I have been, using these resources to inform my view of the battlefield. So, I mean, that mapping was relatively straightforward. Once I had the Cope map registered, it was pretty easy to get the fields, the fence lines, the fence types, the locations of waterways. All of that stuff was relatively straightforward. I mean, it took a little while to map because there was so much of it, but that work is complete. Likewise, the roads are off of the Cope map. They are not copied over from modern OSM, although they were referenced against modern OSM when using MapWarper to rectify the map. So one of the long-term projects here, maybe it'll be shorter term, one of the things that interests me is the fact that we actually have these troop movements outlined down to relatively low unit levels. And it should be possible to transcribe that data into the map so that we actually have a record of the troop movements from the Cope map in OpenHistoricalMap. And now there's some debate over whether or not that kind of transient information belongs in OpenHistoricalMap. And I've been dithering about it because I can't see that argument, but I'm thinking that right now OHM is a database we have, and if we create some new tagging scheme, OHM specific, for mapping this kind of transient information, in the worst case, if we decide it doesn't belong there, it will be relatively easy to extract and move to a separate database. But in the short term, if we actually want to do something about this, is that putting it into OHM now is a path of least resistance, and it may turn out to be fine. I mean, we literally haven't done it yet. There's also been some experimentation with this in our distant sibling project, OpenHistoricMap. For those who don't know OpenHistoricMap, it was founded a short time after OpenHistoricalMap was founded. Unfortunately, it has the same initials, so it can cause a lot of confusion. They have a lot of similar ideas, dealing with a lot of similar problems. but they have a different model for what kinds of contributions are accepted, and so that's become a little bit of a barrier to crossover between the projects. Now they tend to name this kind of transient information ephemeral data, and I'm thinking that I am going to probably just adopt their word for it, because there's don't need to be different for the sake of being different. Ephemeral is a good word for it, so why not? It's not really critical to be different for the sake of being different here. It's not like anybody has a patent or a trademark on using the word ephemeral for data that's ephemeral. It's just an adjective. So what are we going to do here today beyond just point at maps and talk about them? Well, there's this map right here. And this map was discovered in the New York Public Library collection just a few short years ago. Maybe only 2 years ago. It's pretty recent. I don't know. Maybe it actually says when it appeared. In the collection. Okay, it's been in the collection for a long time. Researchers discovered it was in the collection very recently. Now, what is it? This is the Elliott Map. And see here it says the cartographer is S.G. Elliott. So Elliott was already well known. He had created a map in the aftermath of the Battle of Gettysburg, which was a little less than a year later, showing where all of the Union and Confederate temporary burials were on the site. And that Gettysburg map had been known for quite some time, and so its existence is not a mystery. What was only recently discovered in the New York Public Library New York Public Library collection was that Elliott had done a comparable map of the Battle of Antietam. And so it's a little bit of a pain to zoom in here. Because unfortunately the New York Public Library doesn't seem to be putting this stuff into their MapWarper implementation anymore. It seems like the NYPL MapWarper project is sitting there and will probably eventually bit rot. And it's a little bit sad because it's a good resource, but so be it. So here is the Elliott Map, which I have loaded partially into mapwarper.net, which people should know by now. I want to point one thing out back here. If you look, you see that there is a joint across the middle of the Elliott map. This is actually seems to be two pieces of the map laid into a scanner side by side, and the effective result of that, and you can see it here, is that this is only the north section of that map, because there was no way to take that image of the whole thing and do anything at all with it in MapWarper, because that disjoint line was not perfectly lined up in the scanner. And this is not really a new or surprising thing. It happens. So anyway, zooming back in, they're trying to. Okay, we zoomed in a bit too far. The burials of Union troops are represented by the lines with crosses through them. The Confederates are just lines without crosses. And the commas, if my memory serves, represent horses. So this area that we're looking at here, let's zoom out a little bit. Yeah, this is the north end, so that's the North Woods.
And again, referencing where my family lived at the time, that's one of the Poffenberger farms, and that's a candidate for the one that my great-great-grandfather and great-great-grandmother might have lived in, although we have no proof. North Woods, the East Woods, the West Woods. And these are all pretty significant landmarks. A lot of these things haven't really moved in the time since. Some of them have moved. For example, this road right here was the turnpike north to Hagerstown. That road still exists, but the highway has been relocated over here to the west, so this is now just a park road. And at first I thought, well, this looks like a pretty precise map, so probably pretty easy to rectify it and just start mapping graveyards. We would just use OpenStreetMap tagging for cemeteries, but we would put in a start date and an end date to indicate that they were temporary. Now, start date, obviously you don't start burying bodies until after the battle's over. The earliest, therefore, could be the 18th. We know from accounts of the battle that, in fact, the two armies rested in place on the 18th, the day after the battle, and the battle was never rejoined, but it's unlikely that there was a whole lot of burial going on the 18th, as everybody thought that there might be more fighting. But as a practical matter, we'll just set it to the 18th in order to be sure, because probably something did get buried at that point. What happened, though, is as I got into rectification, I started to see problems. There we go. It's been a little slow to load. And the problem manifested itself is the fact that while this map had the appearance of being pretty precisely measured, that it was really, you couldn't get things to line up. And you could get small sections to line up, but then other parts would be out, and as you added reference points, the work would get really distorted. And I realized that while the base map that Elliott used, because he must have gotten a base map from somewhere, had the look of a quality map, it was not nearly as precise as the COPE map, and the COPE map was very easy to line up. So we end up in this situation where we have to look at this and basically start rectifying it piecemeal. And so right now I'm looking at this and I am seeing two yellow control points in rectification and a couple of red ones. I'm going to delete 4 and 1. And then we're just going to rewarp. And we're going to see if things are any better in the vicinity of the east and west woods. And you see, as soon as I do that, look at that big twist that gets put on there. So that's interesting, but then on the other hand, now all of a sudden those are reasonably close. Okay, this is Modern Road Cornfield Avenue, which is on the south edge of the cornfield, and that's actually kind of close. And look, the North Woods are sort of in the right place. But then we've got this slope over to here, and that's kind of off. So it's like with this map warped like this, I want to take a look at Yeah, you see that's the challenge is that the Smoketown Road has been warped way off. So let's go back to rectification. And let's see if we can at least get the Smoketown Road somewhere kind of okay. Yeah, actually we'll probably go delete 2 as well, because that seems like that's one that's dragging us down. Yeah, here's Smoketown Road, and yeah, you can see that this is not really whoever the cartographer was who did this base map. Okay, yeah, you see that's, I kind of decided I wanted to delete this one. Let's change that back over to pan mode, or I don't accidentally drop another control point. So yeah, the one that we are all going to delete down here is 2. And you can kind of see the problem with this map, trying to get it to line up, is that I am using real world control points that I think are fairly well matched up, and there you see our error is down to 0. Let's go look at the big preview. Okay, the area here south of the cornfield. And Smoketown Road is still a little bit of a mystery, just because it shows that big zag over there that I think doesn't really exist. But how is the top up here near the North Woods look? And that looks quite a bit better. That Poffenberger house is dropped in the right spot, more or less. Yeah, we can kind of go with this. We can, at least for the zone inside of Mansfield Avenue, around the cornfield, down in the tail of the Smoketown Road, this is okay. So as long as we limit ourselves as to how far we go, keep it inside that group of roads, we could actually do some mapping here. So we're going to grab this, and looky there, I've already got JOSM running. So we need to add this URL that we grabbed. One 862. Give it layer a name. Okay. Now we need to open the correct part of the map in JOSM. And so this little trick, this works with both OpenStreetMap URLs and OpenHistoricalMap URLs. For anyone who hasn't actually done this before, go to Bounding Box, paste in the URL, and click download. And it will grab the zoom level and the latitude and longitude, and it will give you this area. So the area we're interested in is from the Northwoods south to Smoketown Road, and over in imagery, and yes, I have a lot of imagery URLs in here. 1862 Elliott Antietam Burial. Now we don't really need to get tremendously fussy about this stuff. We know there's a certain measure of approximation to all of this. So I'm just going to treat this particular grouping of Confederate burials as a thing. So tagging, first of all, start date 1862-09-18 is the earliest possible date for the burial. Where do we get an end date from? Well, these were all temporary burials. We know that everyone was reburied somewhere else. Well, not everyone, because they still occasionally run across remains on the battlefield, but the bulk of the bodies were dug up and moved. Well, one answer is that the Antietam National Cemetery is located nearby. Antietam National Cemetery is one of 130 cemeteries of the National Cemetery System, a system that began during the Civil War. There are 4,766 Union remains, 38% unknown, buried here from the Battle of Antietam, South Mountain, Monocacy, and other action in Maryland. There's a tell here. An important tell. These are Union burials. There were not any known Confederate dead buried here. And this is the thing about the time, is that the federal government took responsibility for soldiers who fought on the side of the federal government, that is, the Union soldiers. It paid pensions, it buried them in federal cemeteries. The Confederate states, the states that seceded, were on their own, and so the Confederates who got pensions from their state governments. The bulk of the Confederate cemeteries are separate from the federal cemeteries. So we can look at this and we can find the history of the battlefield and the cemetery, but the truth is I just outlined a bunch of Confederate dead and they were not buried here. So even though I can look at the dates for this, it's not going to help us here. So let's come back over here, and if we look it up, the Western Maryland Historical Library contains a discussion of, look at it, the Washington Confederate Cemetery in Hagerstown, Maryland. This is where they ended up putting the bulk of the remains of the Confederates from these battles. And so we see this was researched by two men from Sharpsburg, Moses Poffenberger and Aaron Good. Well, I'm probably related to Moses Poffenberger. I don't know if I'm related to Aaron Good. They inventoried the dead from the battle, and then the bodies were moved, and the bodies were moved, shows us 1874. So the question is, how long did it take them to move everyone? Do not have individual grave markers. So it's looking like 1874 is probably an adequate date to set here. So end date. And this, of course, will be after all the Federals were relocated. And so finally, OpenStreetMap. I'll get cemetery. Land use equals cemetery. Cemetery independent of place of worship, so cemetery makes sense. So tag. And then let's do this batch of Union graves. And so we're going to use the same land use and the same start date. And let's go take a look at the burial site. Okay, and the other thing is that the Antietam National Cemetery is a little bit unique because it was originally established by the state of Maryland, and certain amount of fighting over whether or not the Confederates should be buried there. They dedicated the cemetery on 1867, so we can see that the Union soldiers got reburied a lot faster. We're going to arbitrarily use 1867 then for the end date on the Union burial plot here. Give it a name, Union temporary burial. Give this a name. Oh, well, let's put the actual name in the right place. And let's put this into OpenHistoricalMap. So temporary burials, Antietam Battlefield from the Elliott Burial Map. So this was what I was trying to get done today.
And I think this is a good point to close out the stream, since I see no questions in chat and have no idea if anybody is actually watching. So I'm just going to say good day, and I may upload the recording of this to YouTube later for people to entertain themselves if they need entertainment that desperately. So I'm going to close out the stream, and tomorrow I'll probably be riding in Zwift at some point.